Chapter 23 of Finn the Wolfhound by Alec John Dawson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 23 The Outcast. For 9 consecutive days and nights, Finn continued to regard the empty gunyah in the clear patch as his home, to eat there and to rest there, beside the ashes of the fire, or in the shadow of the shanty itself. And still Jess and her man came not, and the Wolfhound was left in solitary possession. Once, when the heat of the day was past, Finn trotted down the trail to the township and peered long and earnestly through the dog-leg fence in the direction of the first nugget, but he saw no trace of Jess or her man, and for his part he was glad to get back to the clear patch again, and to take his ease beside the gunyah. He had recently struck up a more than bowing acquaintance with a koala that he had once dragged through a quarter of a mile of scrub to the gunyah, and was now in the habit of meeting this quaint little bear nearly every day. For his part, Koala never presumed to make the slightest advance in Finn's direction, but he had come to realize that the great Wolfhound wished him no harm, and though his conversation seldom went beyond plaintive complainings and lugubrious assertions of his own complete inoffensiveness, Finn liked to sit near the little beast occasionally and watch his fubsy antics and listen to his plaint. Koala was rather like the Mad Hatter that Alice met in Wonderland. He was a very poor man, by his way of it, and though in reality rather a contented creature, seemed generally to be upon the extreme verge of shedding tears. Another of the wild folk that Finn met for the first time in his life during these 9 days, and continued to meet on a friendly footing, was a large native porcupine, or echidna. Finn was sniffing one afternoon at what he took to be the opening to a rabbit's burrow, when, greatly to his surprise, echidna showed up, some 3 or 4 yards away from one of the exits of the same earth. The creature's shock of fretful quills was not inviting, and Finn discovered no inclination to risk touching it with his nose. But having jumped forward in such a way as to shut echidna off from his home, they were left perforce face to face for a few moments. During those moments Finn decided that he had no wish to slay the ant-eating porcupine, and echidna, for his part, made up his exceedingly rudimentary little mind that Finn was a fairly harmless person. So they sat up looking at one another, and Finn marvelled that the world should contain so curious a creature as his new acquaintance, while echidna doubtless wondered in his primitive, prickly fashion how much larger dogs were likely to grow in that part of the country. Then the flying tail of a bandicoot caught Finn's attention, and the passing that way of an unusually fat bulldog ant drew echidna from reflection to business, and the oddly ill-matched couple parted after their first meeting. After this they frequently exchanged civil greetings when their paths happened to cross in the bush. But unlike the large majority of Australia's wild folk, Finn was exclusively a carnivorous animal, and this fact rather placed him out of court in the matter of striking up acquaintances in the bush, since meetings with the Wolfhound were apt, as a general thing, to end in that very close form of intimacy which involves the complete absorption of the lesser personality into the greater, not merely figuratively, but physically. Finn might, and frequently did, ask a stray bandicoot or rabbit or kangaroo rat to dinner, but by the time the meal was ended the guest was no more, and so the acquaintance could never be pursued further. Finn would have been delighted, really, to make friends with creatures like the bandicoot people, and to enjoy their society at intervals, when he was well fed. But the bandicoots and their kind could never forget that they were, after all, food in the Wolfhound's eyes, and it was not possible to know for certain exactly when his appetite was likely to rise within him and claim attention and bandicoots. Therefore, full or empty, hunting or lounging, Finn was a scourge and an enemy in the eyes of these small folk, and as such a person to be avoided at all cost and at all seasons. The hunting in the neighbourhood of the gunyah was still amply sufficient for Finn's needs, and as he continually expected the return of Bill and Jess, he did not forage very far from the clear patch. He generally dozed and rested beside the humpy during the afternoon, preparatory to hunting in the dusk for the kill that represented his night meal. It was on the evening of his 10th day of solitude, and rather later than his usual hour for the evening prowl, that Finn woke with a start in his place beside the gunyah to hear the sound of horses' feet entering the clear patch from the direction of the station homestead. There was no sign of Jess that nose or eye or ear could detect, but Finn told himself as he moved away from the gunyah that this was doubtless Bill, and that Jess would be likely to follow. As his custom was, where Bill was concerned, Finn took up his stand about 25 paces from the humpy, prepared gravely to observe the boundary rider's evening tasks, the fire lighting, and so forth. As the newcomer began to dismount, or rather as he began to think of dismounting, he caught a dim glimpse of Finn's figure through the growing darkness. It was only a dim glimpse the man caught, and he took Finn for a dingo, made wondrous large in appearance somehow by the darkness. He was both astonished and exceedingly indignant that a dingo should have the brazen impudence to stand and stare at him, within 30 yards of camp, too. In his hand he carried a stock whip, with its 15-foot fall neatly coiled about its taper end. Swinging this by the head of its fall, he flung it with all his might at Finn, at the same time rising erect in the saddle and spurring his horse forward at the gallop to ride the supposed dingo down. "Grr, you thieving swine, I'll teach you!" The voice was strange to Finn, and very hoarse and harsh. The Wolfhound cantered lightly off, and the rider followed him right into the scrub before wheeling his horse and turning back toward the camp. Before he moved, Finn gave one snarling growl, and the reason of that was that the heavy butt end of the stock whip handle had caught him fairly in the ribs and almost taken his breath away. From the shelter of the bush, Finn peered for a long while at the camp from which he had been driven, and as he peered his mind held a tumult of conflicting emotions. He saw the man gather twigs and light a fire, just as Bill had been wont to do, but he knew now that the man was not Bill. He heard the man growling and swearing to himself, just as a creature of the wild does sometimes over its meals. As a matter of fact, this particular man had been removed from a post that he liked and sent to this place because Bill had left the district, and he was irritable and annoyed about it. Otherwise he probably would not have been so savage in driving Finn off, but the Wolfhound had no means of knowing these things. All his life long, up till the time of his separation from the Master, Finn had been treated with uniform kindness and consideration, save during one very brief interval in Sussex. Then for months he had been treated with what seemed to him utterly purposeless and reasonless cruelty and ferocity. From that long drawn-out martyrdom had sprung his deep-rooted mistrust of man. But it had been reserved for Wallaby Bill's successor to implant in Finn's mind the true spirit of the wild creature by the simple process of driving him forth from the neighbourhood of civilization, such as it was, into the bush. Finn had been cruelly beaten, he had been tortured in the past. He had never until this evening been driven away from the haunts of men. The writer of these lines remembers having once been driven himself, under a shower of sticks and stones, from a village of mountain-bred Moors who saw through his disguise. This being driven, hunted, shooed out into the open with blows and curses and scornful maledictions, is a singularly cowing sensation, at once humiliating and embittering. It is unlike any other kind of hostile treatment. It affected Finn more deeply and powerfully than any punishment could have affected him. Though infinitely less painful and terrible than the sort of interviews he had had with the professor in his circus prison, it yet bit deeper into his soul, in a way. It produced an impression at least equally profound. He desired none of the man's society, and during all the time that he had regarded the camp in that clearing as his home, he had never sought anything at man's hands, nor approached man more nearly than a distance of a dozen paces or so. But now he was savagely given to understand that even the neighbourhood of the camp was no place for him, that it was forbidden ground for him. He was driven out into the wild with contumely, and with the contemptuous sting of the blows of something flung at him. It was no longer a case of man courting him, while he carefully maintained an attitude of reserve and kept his distance. Man had set the distance, and definitely pronounced him an alien, driven him off. Man was actively hostile to him, would fling something at him on sight. Man declared war on him, and drove him out into the wild. Well, and what of the wild? The wild yielded him unlimited food and unlimited interest. The wild was clean and free. It hampered him in no way. It had offered no sort of hostile demonstration against him. Nay, in a sense, the wild had paid court to him, shown him great deference, bowed down before him, and granted him instant lordship. If Finn thought at all just now of the snake people, it was of the large, non-venomous kind, of which he had slain several. Altogether, it was with a curiously disturbed and divided mind, in which bitterness and resentment were uppermost, that the Wolfhound gazed now at the man sitting in the firelight by Bill's gunyah. And then, while he gazed, there rose up in him kindly thoughts and feelings regarding Jess, when she had played with him beside that fire. Regarding Bill, when he had talked at Finn in his own friendly, admiring way, and tossed the Wolfhound food which Finn had always eaten with an appearance of zest and gratitude, even when not in the least need of food, from an instinctive sense of noblesse oblige, and of the courtesy which came to him with the blood of a long line of kingly ancestors. Vague thoughts, too, of the Master drifted through Finn's mind as he watched the stranger at his supper, and somehow the circle of firelit grass attracted. Forgiveness came natural to the Wolfhound, and for the moment he forgot the humiliation and the bitterness of being driven out as a creature of the wild, having no right to trespass upon the human environment. Slowly, not with any particular caution, but with stately, gracious step, Finn moved forward toward the firelight, intending to take up his old resting-place, perhaps a score of paces from the fire. No sooner had Finn entered the outermost ring of dim firelight than the man looked up and saw, not the whole of him, but the light flickering on his legs. "Well, I'll be teetotally damned if that ain't the limit!" gasped the man, as he sprang to his feet. He snatched a 3-foot length of burning sapling from the fire, and, rushing forward, flung it so truly after the retreating Wolfhound that it fell athwart his neck, singeing his coat and enveloping him from nose to tail in a cloud of glowing sparks. A stone followed the burning wood, and the man himself, shouting and cursing, followed the stone. But he had no need to run. The flying sparks, the smell of burned hair, the horrible suggestion of the red-hot iron bar, these were amply sufficient for Finn, without the added humiliation of the stone and the curses and the man's loud, blundering footfalls. The Wolfhound broke into a gallop, shocked, amazed, alarmed, and beyond words embittered. He snarled as he ran, and he ran till the camp was a mile behind him, beyond scent and hearing. There was no mistaking this for anything but what it was. This was being driven out of the human world into the world of the wild with a vengeance. The burning sapling made a most profound impression upon Finn, and aroused bitter hostility and resentment in him. The stock whip and the stone were as nothing beside this thing, this fire that had been flung at him. From time immemorial men have frightened and chased wolves from their chosen neighbourhood with burning faggots. The thing is being done today in the world's far places. It was being done thousands of years before our era began. Finn had never before experienced it, and yet, in some vague way, it seemed he had known of such things. His ancestors for 1,500 years had been the admired companions and champions of the leaders among men. But 1,000 years before that, who knows? Our domestic pet dogs of today adhere still to a few of the practices, having no bearing upon their present lives, of their forebears of many, many centuries back. Certain it is that nothing else in his life had been quite so full of hostile significance for Finn as this fact of his having been driven out from the camp in the clear patch with a faggot of burning wood. This was man's message to him. Thus, then, he was sent to his place, and his place was the wild. Well, the wild folk of that particular section of the Tynagh country, though they live to be older than the most aged cockatoo in all Australia, will never, never forget the strange happenings of that night, which they will always remember as the night of the madness of the giant wolf, only they thought of him as the giant dingo. For 4 mortal hours the Irish Wolfhound, who had been driven out from the haunts of men, raged furiously up and down a 5-mile belt of Tynagh country, slaying and maiming wantonly, and implanting desperate fear in the hearts of every living thing in that countryside. Once, in the farthest of his gallops, he reached the fringe of the wild, rocky hill country which lies behind this belt, and there, as luck would have it, he met in full flight one of the 2 dingoes that had escaped him on the day of the attack upon wounded Jess. It was an evil chance for that dingo. A fanged whirlwind smote him, and rended him from limb to limb before he realized that the devastating thing had come, scattering his vital parts among the scrub and tearing wildly at his mangled remains. A mother kangaroo was surprised by the ghostly grey fury, at some distance from the rest of her small mob, and though she fought with the fury of 10 males of her species, bitterly conscious of the young thing glued to the teat in her pouch, she was left a torn and trampled mass of scarcely recognizable fur and flesh, crushed among scrub roots. Lesser creatures succumbed under the blinding stabs of Finn's feet, and once he leaped, like a cat, clear into the lower branches of a bastard oak tree, and pinned a possum into instant death before swinging back to earth on the limb's far side. He killed that night from fury, and not to eat, and when he laid him down to rest at length on the rocky ledge of a gully fully 4 miles from the camp, there was not a living thing in that district but felt the terror of his presence and cowered from sight or sound of his flying feet and rending blood-stained fangs. It was as the night of an earthquake or a bush-fire to the wild folk of that range, and the cause and meaning of it all was that Finn, the Irish Wolfhound, had been hunted out of the menfolk's world into the world of the wild people. End of chapter 23.